On the 1st of October, 1995, a young man turned 24, and to celebrate, he went to look at a painting he wanted to steal. He drove there in a blue Opel through the Black Forest, his girlfriend beside him, and his mother in the back with her dachshund on her lap. Their destination was a castle in Baden-Baden, the New Castle, where Sotheby's had laid out an entire estate auction across more than 100 rooms for public viewing. His mother stayed outside once they arrived because dogs weren't allowed in, which was ideal given the circumstances. And so it was just the two of them who went in, the young man and the woman he loved, to see the thing he had been thinking about since he first opened that auction catalog. It was a small portrait, painted on wood, by Lucas Cranach the Younger, of a woman named Sybil of Cleves. She was 5 centuries old and worth millions, and she sat on a little tabletop easel in the center of a room, under a dome of clear plexiglass. When the young man looked at her, he didn't see a valuable object or an auction lot. He saw, in his words, the individual threads of her dress and the blue of the blood in her veins. It was a Sunday, and the castle was busy, and there was a guard in nearly every room. His girlfriend leaned in and whispered to him not to be an idiot. And he tried, for a while, to be good. They wandered through the other rooms, and he reminded himself that a smart thief knows when to walk away, that a theft here could bring the police closer than they had ever been. But he had already noticed the most important detail, the one that stopped him from fully letting the possibility of theft go, which was that the plexiglass dome was not locked. So they came back to the room. The afternoon was getting late by then, the crowds had thinned, and the guard assigned to that room was standing in the doorway talking to a colleague. In a small gallery like that, you can see where everyone is, and the young man stood very still and watched them all, and waited for the room to breathe, for the half-second when no one would be looking his way. When it came, he glanced at his girlfriend. She had been tracking every guard in the room the entire time. She gave him a small nod. He lifted the dome, took the Cranach, and slid it flat between the pages of his auction catalog. And then, while setting the dome back down into place, he knocked over the little easel that had held her. The plastic stand hit the hardwood table like a thunderclap, or at least that's how it sounded to him. But he was in too deep, so he set the dome back on top of the toppled easel and turned around to face whatever consequences were coming his way. As luck would have it, it was a chatty room, and no one had heard a thing. He and his girlfriend calmly walked out, down the stairs towards the exit, past the guards in their jackets and ties with radio earpieces, who may or may not have already been told a painting was missing. He didn't change his pace, and neither did she. And then they were outside in the last of the daylight, and the painting was theirs. His name was Stéphane Breitwieser. Over about 7 years, he and the woman beside him would steal more than 200 works of art from museums across Europe, and he would insist for the rest of his life that he was not a thief. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. In Breitwieser's view of it, he was not an art thief. He knows this sounds absurd, coming from a man who has stolen more art than almost anyone alive. A man who can recount some of his crimes down to the number of steps it took to carry a painting out a museum door. But that label disgusts him, because the people who wear it disgust him. He has nothing but contempt for the ordinary art thief, the smash-and-grab man, the one who cuts a canvas out of its frame in the dark. He hates a crime like the Gardner heist in Boston, where masked men tied up the guards and took 13 works in the middle of the night and irreparably damaged them in the process. That, to Breitwieser, is not art theft. It is ambitious vandalism. His own thefts, he insists, follow a code. They happen in daylight. He never uses force and never threatens anyone. He will not damage a work to take it, and if he cannot get a piece out of its frame cleanly and calmly, with the respect it deserves, he will simply leave it and walk away. And he never, ever steals for money. He finds the very idea that a person could look at something beautiful and see a price disgraceful. Good money, he points out, can be made with far less risk than this. No, he doesn't do it for the money. He does it because he cannot help himself. What moves him is beauty, and only beauty. He takes what stirs him, and often the thing that stirs him is not the most valuable object in the room. He describes the feeling as physical, almost electrical. A tremor that starts in his fingers when he stands in front of the right piece, a buzz that spreads over his skin as if a circuit were completing between his body and the work. It builds to something he calls, using his French, a coup de cœur, a blow to the heart. When he feels it, he knows he will go to almost any length to have the thing that caused it. He eventually found a more formal name for this that made him feel less alone, although it is not recognized as an official disorder. That would be Stendhal syndrome, a term coined in the 1970s and named for the 19th century writer who, in 1817, walked into the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, looked up at the frescoes, and was so overcome that he thought he might burst, and had to stagger out and sit down on a bench before he fainted. Breitwieser read about the condition and felt what he called a shock of recognition. Here, at last, was proof that a person could be undone by beauty, that it could hit like a physical force. But he is, it should be said, the only person on record who claims to have Stendhal syndrome, who is also known to have stolen the things that gave it to him. His love for art being as strong as it is, he has many thoughts about the best ways to interact with it. It should be intimate, personal, and special. Museums do not give you that. Museums, he says, are prisons for art. Think about the last time you tried to have a real moment with a great painting. All of the crowds, the velvet ropes, the glass, the guard watching you, the bench that was too far away or occupied or not there at all when you most want it. The hours that end before you're ready. With all of those obstacles, he says, a work of art is a captive, kept at a distance from the very people who might actually love it. He doesn't feel like he's stealing from the public. He feels he is rescuing something from an institution that has locked it away and called that care. He has a point. So again, he does not think of himself as a thief. He thinks of himself as an art liberator. A collector, he once said, with an unorthodox acquisition style. Breitwieser was born in 1971 in Alsace, a corner of France that presses up against both Germany and Switzerland. His family lived comfortably. His father, Roland, managed a chain of department stores, and his mother, Mireille Stengel, was a nurse who specialized in the care of children. The house was full of beautiful old things like Louis XV armchairs from the 1700s, empire dressers from the 18th century, and the boy grew up among them, falling in love with the past. The people he loved most were his grandparents on his mother's side. They gave him pocket money, and he spent it at flea markets where he bought telling objects like Stone Age tools, little bronze figures, and old glass flower vases. His grandfather used to take him to the beach with a cane and tap the sand, and when he tapped, the boy knew to start digging. He would dig up little ceramic shards and bits of the buried past, and his grandfather let him keep them in a little blue bin. That is one of the first pictures we have of Stéphane Breitwieser, a boy on his knees in the sand, unearthing broken, beautiful things, filling a container with them. He was not, by his own account, an easy adolescent. He was moody and anxious and stiff, awkward with other people, more comfortable with objects than with company. He subscribed to archaeological journals and fine art magazines. He read about medieval poetry and classical architecture. He even volunteered on a local dig. He would later say that he took refuge in the past, and when his depressive spells came, his parents learned that the surest way to lift his spirits was to drop him off at a museum. It worked every time. His first theft, if you can even really call it that, happened on one of those trips. He liked to run his hand along the surfaces of things when the guards weren't watching, and one day his finger caught on a loose piece of metal on a Roman coffin, and a small coin-sized piece of lead came away into his palm. He quickly put it in his pocket. He did not consider this stealing. He decided it was a gift from the gods of antiquity. Then, when he was 19, his parents separated, and the world he had built himself out of beautiful objects came apart. His father moved out and took the things with him. The ivory miniatures, the furniture, the flintlock pistols, the antiques the boy had loved. Breitwieser felt it as an abandonment so total that he cut off contact with his father entirely and would stay estranged from him for years. He and his mother moved into a smaller apartment, which she furnished out of necessity with things from IKEA. And by his own telling, that detail crushed him almost as much as the divorce. The beautiful house was gone. He was, he decided, done with the rules of society that had let this happen to him. He started shoplifting, and the only lesson he took from getting caught was that he should not get caught again. And then, at a birthday party in 1991, when they were both 20, he met Anne Catherine Kleinklaus. She came from more modest means than he did. Her father was a line cook, her mother worked in a daycare, and she was the oldest of 3. The world Stéphane had grown up in, the motorboat on Lake Geneva, the skiing in the Alps, the tennis lessons, and the scuba certificate, none of that had been a part of her childhood. But something in the pairing seemed to wake her up. Falling in love with Stéphane, by the accounts of the people who knew them, opened a door in Anne Catherine to a kind of adventure she hadn't known she wanted. And something in her steadied him. He would say for the rest of his life that she was his true aesthetic muse, the one who shaped his taste into what it would become. Their first real theft together came in 1994, in an Alsatian village called Thun. In the local museum, they saw a flintlock pistol from the early 18th century, carved in walnut and inlaid with silver. His father had collected flintlocks, and they had been the boy's favorite things in the lost family collection. He noticed that the panel on the display case had no lock, a detail he knew to look for because he had once, briefly, worked as a museum security guard himself, for exactly 1 month, before he decided he hated having a job. He also noticed that there were no other visitors, no alarms, no cameras, and that the only person working was a student who was downstairs. He framed the theft to Anne Catherine as a final act of defiance against his father, and she understood because she didn't get along with his father either. He opened the case, took the pistol, put it in his backpack, and they left. That was the beginning. For the next several years, they were extraordinarily good at it. There was a method, though not much of a plan. Breitwieser gathered museum brochures by the armload from tourist offices and hotel lobbies, and he thumbed through every art magazine he could find in every library and newsstand he passed. Sometimes an image would leap off the page at him, and his fingers would start their familiar twitch, and he would read the caption and file away where the thing lived. Museums he'd visited as a child stayed in his memory too. He could still feel the pull of works he'd stood in front of as a boy. All of it went onto a mental list. When Anne Catherine could get a week off from the hospital where she worked as a nurse's assistant, he would map a route, and they would set off on a road trip, stringing several pieces from the list together like beads. That was the extent of the planning. Everything after that happened in the moment, improvised, and entirely dependent on how many tourists were around, how alert the guards were, what the security happened to be that day. Plenty of times they walked into a museum, took one look, and decided the conditions were wrong and left with nothing. His only dedicated tool was a Swiss Army knife packed with gadgets. Everything else was nerve and timing. Anne Catherine was the careful one. Her tolerance for risk ran lower than his, and though she never let it show in the museums, she was often frightened inside them, and she held them both to strict rules. Nothing wider than about 1.5 feet on each side, so a painting could lie flat against his back, and nothing bigger than a brick, so a sculpture wouldn't bulge in a coat or a bag. He would get the itch to take something, and she would say no, and he would nearly always listen. She would watch the guards while he took in the whole room. She was cautious where he was carried away. It was a kind of balance, and it held for a long time. They lived all this while in Mulhouse, an automobile and chemical town in the industrial belt of eastern France, which has been described as one of the least attractive places in a country brimming with beauty. They lived in his mother's house, rent-free, and they were broke. Perpetually, genuinely broke. Anne Catherine's job didn't pay much, and Breitwieser mostly collected government benefits and picked up the occasional shift waiting tables or stocking shelves. His mother lived on the ground floor of the house and never went upstairs, and when they carried things in, they told her they were knockoffs or knickknacks from the flea market. Because upstairs was the collection. You reached it by a narrow staircase, up to 2 rooms tucked beneath the roof, the ceilings low, the shutters permanently closed, and the doors kept locked. And inside, over the years, they built something that has to be described to be believed. Oil paintings covered every part of the walls, mostly from the 16th and 17th centuries. Cranach and Bruegel and Boucher and Watteau and Dürer, until there was no wall left, and the paintings had to be stacked on the furniture and propped against each other on the floor. There was silver everywhere, platters and bowls and goblets and beer tankards. There were tapestries and a medieval knight's helmet and flintlock pistols and a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary. There was a golden tobacco box that had once belonged to Napoleon, and ivory carvings, and a nautilus shell chalice. Every object had its own folder in a filing box, with photocopied reference entries and index cards in his schoolboy handwriting, and his own careful line drawings, labeled with dimensions. His personal art library, also up there in the attic, eventually passed 500 books. And above the 4-poster bed where they slept, there was a small ivory carving of Adam and Eve. He would lie there some nights and reach up and touch it. It was one of his 2 favorite things in the world. By the mid-90s, they were stealing 3 weekends out of every 4. They wore Hugo Boss and Chanel into the museums, not because they were rich, but because Breitwieser had a theory that a well-dressed young couple is invisible in a way that a masked man never is. Crime works best, he liked to say, not when you overpower everyone, but when nobody even knows a crime has occurred. On the canopy of their bed, they also kept a scrapbook, and into it they pasted every newspaper article about their own thefts. And he would reread them and imagine the police describing him as an aristocrat, an honorable thief. He would also find relief in them, because they made it clear that nobody had any idea these thefts were connected, or who might be responsible for them. All told, at its height, the collection on the other side of those locked doors was worth, by later estimates, somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 billion. He would tell you he was its guardian, that he loved every piece, that he would take better care of these works than any museum ever had. And for a while, that was almost a story you could believe. The trouble started quietly, and it started with the walls running out of room. There was simply too much. The paintings came off the walls and onto the floor. Things got stacked on the furniture and then on the ground, and at one point a shoe caddy in the closet was pressed into service as a cubby for brass. This is the same man who insisted that he, unlike the careless institutions he robbed, would protect these things. And here is what protection began to look like. To get a tapestry out of a museum, he threw it out a window into the muddy bushes below, retrieved it, and then shoved it under his bed. Wooden panels that were centuries old began to separate and warp in the damp, still air of the attic, and rather than risk taking a stolen masterpiece to a restorer, he tried to fix one himself, forcing the panels back into rough position and sealing them with super glue. Anne Catherine had some choice words for what the stealing had become by then. She called it dirty. She called it maniacal. And here is where his whole philosophy begins to turn inside out. Breitwieser said museums fail to offer any intimate encounter with art, that they wall beauty off behind glass and guards and rules. But if you look at the museums he actually robbed, they were not the great fortresses. He never tested himself against a place like the Louvre. He went after small regional museums, the underfunded ones, and it's very clear why they were vulnerable. These places, which were short on money, chose again and again to spend what they had on acquiring more art rather than on better security, because new works draw crowds and thread-thin tracking devices do not. And in a small museum, there's often an unspoken pact in force. The museum lets the public get close to priceless things, barely secured, a foot from your face. And the public, in turn, leaves those things alone, out of a shared understanding that works of common heritage should be open to everyone. That closeness, that trust, is the exact intimacy Breitwieser claimed museums denied him. It was not really being withheld from him. It was being handed to him freely as a thing held in common. And it was the entire reason he could steal at all. And what did he do with it? He took the works out of the open, where anyone could stand near them, and he carried them up a narrow staircase into 2 low rooms with the shutters nailed shut and the doors locked and a single key, where the only public was 2 people, and where the panels warped and the tapestries went under the bed. He said museums were prisons for art. Then he built the tightest prison any of these objects had ever known. The first time the world caught up with him was in a gallery in Lucerne in May of 1997. They rarely stole from commercial galleries, and Anne Catherine did not want to that day. The gallery was small, they were the only visitors, and the 2 employees there were watching them. It was hot, and Breitwieser had no jacket to hide a painting under. To top it all off, the gallery was directly across the street from a police station. Every instinct they had built over these years said no. But there was a painting on the wall by the Flemish artist Willem van Alst, and Breitwieser decided his collection could not be complete without it. And he talked himself into believing the risk was small. Trust me, he told her. I know how to do this. I love you. He kissed her, lifted the painting off the wall, and tucked it under his arm. They made it about 20 steps before a hand landed on his shoulder from behind and spun him around to face one of the gallery employees, who asked him what he was doing with that painting. He had no answer. He stammered something that he could never remember. Anne Catherine begged the man to let him go. Instead, they were arrested and taken to the holding cells of the police station across the street. They got out of it. In the prison van the next morning in separate cages, but close enough to whisper, they agreed on their story. This was the only time they had ever tried to steal anything. And in court, Breitwieser wept and lied beautifully. He had never done anything like this in his life. He didn't know what had come over him, and his girlfriend had nothing to do with it. He was sorry, and he sought redemption. The court believed him. Neither of them had a record in Switzerland, and it didn't occur to anyone to call the country's art crime investigator, who was already starting to suspect that the spate of thefts in his country may somehow be connected. They were released on bail, given suspended sentences and small fines, and banned from Switzerland for 3 years. His mother paid the bail and drove them home, and for 10 minutes her fury filled the house, every question she had been swallowing for years coming out at once. Are you completely nuts? Do you have any idea the harm you're causing? And then her protectiveness closed back over the anger, and she hired an expensive attorney, and the thing was made to disappear. But something had opened in Anne Catherine that would not close. She was awake now to the fear she'd been holding down. She was afraid for her future. She understood, suddenly and completely, that she had been with this man for 6 years, that they still lived in his mother's attic, that the place of their own he kept promising was never going to exist, that the police were not going to stop, and that there was no answer to the simplest question of all. What was the end game? What were they going to do with all of it? She gave him an ultimatum, her or the art. He refused to answer. She backed down in the end. She offered him a compromise instead. He would steal less and more carefully, and he would always wear surgical gloves. He agreed. What neither of them could say out loud was that the compromise was meant to slow the stealing down, and instead it seemed to give it a second wind. Then, in the spring of 1998, Breitwieser learned that Anne Catherine had had an abortion, arranged with the help of his mother, while the 3 of them were traveling in the Netherlands. He drove to the hospital where she worked in a rage, and they had a screaming fight, and he slapped her hard across the face before storming off. She went home, packed her things, and moved back in with her parents. She got her driver's license and rented a studio apartment. And for 4 months, he called, and she did not answer. And in those 4 months, he didn't steal a single thing. When she finally picked up, she set one condition. If you ever lift a hand to me again, I'm gone forever. She wouldn't forbid him to steal. She knew she couldn't do that. But she would no longer take an active part in it. She kept her own apartment, but she moved back into the attic. The great lover of beauty, it turned out, could not love the person in front of him enough to stop. And the thing he called devotion was beginning to look like something that consumed whatever it touched. By 2000, the Swiss ban had expired, and Breitwieser found the best-paying job of his life, waiting tables at an upscale brasserie just across the border in Switzerland for around $4,000 a month. He tried genuinely to feed the need for excitement in legal ways. He took Anne Catherine on a 2-week vacation to the Dominican Republic and didn't steal once. but his commute to work ran an hour and a half each way, and he spent it cataloging every museum along the route. Anne Catherine begged him not to steal in Switzerland again. They had been lucky once. A second arrest there would be catastrophic. He agreed with her, and then he lied to her and did it anyway, sometimes returning to museums they had already robbed, whose security, he noted, had not improved at all in the years since. On a day late in 2001, he went alone to the Richard Wagner Museum, also located in Lucerne, and stole a bugle. It was in a sealed display box mounted almost at the ceiling, and to reach it, he had to climb onto a radiator and reach up with his Swiss Army knife to unscrew the panel. He did not wear gloves. He had broken both of the rules Anne Catherine held sacred, the gloves and no stealing in Switzerland, in a single afternoon. When he told her, she was terrified because his fingerprints were now all over another Swiss crime scene in the same country where they'd already been arrested once. He promised to drive back and wipe them clean, but she said that was too risky, that she would do it herself early in the morning on her day off. He insisted on at least driving her, and she let him. They drove in her car, barely speaking. She told him to wait outside, and he said he'd take a little walk. She bought a ticket and went up to the second floor to clean his prints from the case. He circled the outside of the museum, watching for her, and there were only a few people around. One of them, an older man walking a dog, who seemed to look at Breitwieser a beat too long. Then Anne Catherine came out of the museum, walking fast, almost jogging, which was wrong because they had a rule about never looking like they were fleeing. She was trying to tell him something across the distance, her face anxious, her hands moving, and he couldn't hear her. And while he was still trying to read her, a police car pulled up, and 2 officers got out, and one of them took out a pair of handcuffs. As they closed around his wrists, he found her face one more time across the parking lot. The police never noticed her at all. What he didn't know yet was that the old man with the dog was a retired radio journalist who had read about the bugle theft in the local paper that morning and had noticed a man circling the museum and staring up at its windows wearing the same green coat that had been described in the article, and had gone inside to say so. What he didn't know was that this was the last free day of his life for a very long time. And what he could not have imagined was that while he sat in a Swiss cell, the entire collection, everything on the other side of those locked doors, was already beginning to disappear. The interrogations came first. The inspector in Lucerne, a man named Roland Meyer, was almost exactly Breitwieser's age, lean, blue-eyed, speaking the same Alsatian accented German. Meyer assumed he had a petty thief on his hands. He tried a bluff, telling Breitwieser that his fingerprints were everywhere. This made Breitwieser nervous, and he was just about ready to confess. But then Meyer pushed further and said that he'd been spotted in Lucerne the night of the bugle theft. But Breitwieser had gone straight home that night, so he knew the second claim was false, which told him the first one was a bluff too. And so instead of confessing, he held his ground and gave up nothing. He realized with some relief that the police thought he had acted alone, that they had no idea Anne Catherine existed. He thought he could use that. He hoped to phone her and have her quietly return the bugle, leave it under a bush for a passerby to find, and manufacture an alibi. But he was classified as a high-security inmate and was allowed no calls at all. And so he waited, in a cell close to solitary, staring at bare walls. And the hardest part about it wasn't the isolation, but those bare walls. Even art he despised, he admitted, would have been something. Take away the images, and you take away everything. He wrote to Anne Catherine, The letters were pure lament, all abandonment and suffering and tears, with 2 little hearts drawn at the bottom. He got no answer. 10 days passed, then more, in total silence, not just from her, but from everyone. His first arrest in Lucerne had lasted about a day because his mother had stepped in. That was the baseline he was measuring against, and the comparison made the silence unbearable. He began to work out what must have happened. Anne Catherine, clearing his prints, must have overheard the exchange in the museum about a suspicious man circling outside. She speaks German, she would have understood. She would have tried to warn him, but too late. After that, he couldn't account for what she'd done, or what she might have told his mother that would keep his mother silent too. And so, after weeks of it, alone, without a lawyer, knowing nothing about the warrant grinding its way through 2 countries' bureaucracies, he convinced himself that continued silence would only lengthen his sentence. When Meyer next asked if he was ready to talk, he said yes. He confessed to the bugle, wrapped in lies meant to protect the attic. He said the bugle was in a cardboard box in his mother's garage. He had wanted to gift it to his mother as a Christmas present. In fact, he had hung its strap on the corner of one of his stolen paintings and had decided, whatever happened, never to mention the attic at all. His whole cover story had 3 jobs: protect Anne Catherine, protect his mother, and get him home by Christmas. But Meyer did not believe a word of the sentimental thief and ended the session. If the truth wouldn't come from Breitwieser, it would come from somewhere else. So Meyer went to a judge and asked for a warrant to search Breitwieser's home. It was granted. 23 days into his custody, the international warrant was cleared, and on the 12th of December, Meyer crossed the border with another Swiss inspector and 2 French detectives and drove into the suburbs of Mulhouse to a coral white house with a clothesline out back at 5:30 on a Wednesday evening. Breitwieser's mother, Mireille, opened the door, gray threading through her blonde hair, and told them there was no need to search, that she didn't know what they meant, that her son had brought nothing home. But she had to let them in. They climbed the narrow stairs and found the attic door was unlocked. Inside, nothing. No bugle, no instruments, no silver, no ivory, no gold. Not one Renaissance painting. Not even a picture hook. Clean, empty walls around a 4-poster bed. Back in Switzerland, Meyer returned to interrogating Breitwieser, sliding photographs of stolen loot across the interrogation table. And one by one, Breitwieser confessed to their thefts, not knowing the attic was already bare. A gold medallion, a tobacco box, and then a whole spilled mass of photos with an ivory flute, a bronze figurine, a silver goblet, the flintlock pistol from 10 that had been the very first thing he and Anne Catherine ever took. When the photographs ran out, he had confessed to 107 thefts, and later, drawn out over hours by a second detective who flattered him rather than bullied him, he would proudly volunteer the number that made it one of the largest crimes in history. 69 Renaissance paintings. Where were they? They asked him. The last time I saw them, he said, was in the attic. So where did those photographs come from, if nothing was in the attic? A week after Breitwieser's arrest, an older man named James Lance was walking at sunset along the Rhone-Rhine Canal in Alsace, part of the old system of waterways Napoleon built to link France's rivers. He saw 2 objects glinting in the water, which he assumed would be junk. Nevertheless, he came back the next day with a telescoping rake and pulled out a silver chalice stamped 1619, and then a goblet, and then another, and then a hunting knife engraved with a woman's portrait. He called the police. Divers came, 30 of them at times, from the Strasbourg River Brigade. and they drained a half-mile stretch of the canal, and for 3 days, the pieces kept piling up on the shore. There were silver platters and bowls and tumblers, a dazzling silver warship, medieval weapons and a knight's helmet, 2 Gallet vases, 6 gold pocket watches, an hourglass, a table clock, 1 oil painting, spared from ruin only because it happened to be painted on copper rather than wood, and a wealth of ivory, including a small virtuoso carving of Adam and Eve, which came out of the water no worse for its time there. A dealer who was called to assess the haul was stunned by its quality and valued it at $50 million, and said that whoever had owned these things was a real connoisseur. Somebody had thrown all of it into the canal. And that is where the 3 collapses I've been describing finally meet, in the story of a single night. The precise timeline of that night has never fully come out, and there remain gaps. Breitwieser pieced it together over the years from his mother's police statements and from what he could glean from investigators, and the account below is his best understanding, not a verified record. As he understands it, Anne Catherine drove back from the Wagner Museum, where she'd watched him arrested, went straight to his mother's house, and told his mother why her son wasn't with her. And his mother, who had for years lived on the ground floor and told herself the things upstairs were flea market junk, climbed the narrow stairs and finally saw the attic for what it was. She was not in that moment spellbound by the beauty. She was a nurse, a churchgoer, a respected woman, and she understood at once that her unemployed adult son might have just destroyed her life. That everything in that room was almost certainly stolen. That she could be charged as an accessory hundreds of times over and financially ruined and imprisoned. Every object in that room, she later told the police, felt like a personal assault. And then, according to what she told investigators, she began to destroy it. She swept the furniture clear and sent the displayed objects crashing down. She yanked paintings off the walls, 20 of them, 50, she couldn't even say. She hauled up garbage bags and cardboard boxes and stuffed them with silver and ivory and ceramic and what she called the quote-unquote metal junk. She loaded her car and drove north 30 minutes, alone, in the dark, to a secluded bridge over the Rhone-Rhine Canal, where she used to walk her dogs. And she moved along the shore, throwing things into the water. She told police she felt nothing throwing them, that the pieces meant nothing to her. The silver and the ivory went into the water, and the water, it turned out, was survivable. The canal pieces came out tarnished and dirty and needing cleaning, but mostly whole. The Adam and Eve sculpture went into that canal, and the Adam and Eve sculpture he so loved came back. But the paintings did not go into the water. By his account, and by what his mother eventually admitted, the more than 60 oil paintings, the Cradocs and the Bruegels, everything on wood, were driven somewhere secluded. A forest was all she would say, and heaped into a pile. And there, she told the police, she set them on fire. The old panels were bone dry and the oil paint was combustible, and the flames went up fast, and the whole stack burned down to almost nothing but ash. Now, why did she do it? There is no clear answer. His mother will never speak about it. In her interrogation, she told the police in her own words that she wanted to hurt her son, to punish him for all the hurt he had caused her, which is why she destroyed everything that belonged to him. The psychologists who examined the family read it differently, landing on something stranger and sadder. That she had a possessive love and hate relationship with her only child, that she craved a bond with him like the one he had with his art, and that she had come to see the collection as a rival for his affection, more powerful even than his girlfriend. As long as the pieces existed, in a museum or in an attic, they held him. And so, the reading goes, while he was locked up and defenseless, she destroyed her rivals and punished him in the way she knew would hurt him most. And then there's Breitwieser's own version, which he needs to be true. He wants to believe, chooses to believe that she did it out of love, that she cleared the attic to protect him, to keep the police from finding proof, an extreme version of a mother flushing her child's drugs down the toilet, the ultimate act of maternal devotion. And then, at trial years later, she would take the stand and recant all of it, say she had confessed under duress, that she had thrown nothing away, that she had never even seen an oil painting in her son's rooms. The only person who knows what happened in that forest will not say. She will, Breitwieser believes, go to her grave with it. The story could end there in the ash, and it would already be a tragedy. But what Breitwieser does next is, to me, the part that turns a sad story into an unbearable one, because it is the part where you understand that none of this reached him. The trials came first. In Switzerland in early 2003, his attorney made an argument that is genuinely fascinating, that Breitwieser had not really stolen these works, that he had borrowed them. It sounds ridiculous, and yet lawyers have won on arguments very close to it before. When Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington was stolen from London's National Gallery in 1961, the thief kept it for 4 years, then turned himself in, and a barrister got him acquitted of stealing the painting. He was convicted only of stealing the frame and served 3 months. When Vincenzo Peruggia took the Mona Lisa in 1911, his lawyer framed it as love and patriotism, and Peruggia served 7 months and 9 days for one of the most audacious art crimes in history. In both cases, though, the works came back intact, the attorney pointed out, which is all Breitwieser ever wanted to do. But the Swiss prosecutor was not moved. His crimes were in no way harmless, she said. He averaged a theft every 12 days for 7 years. He had damaged museums and cultures and heritage, and the victims were all of us. But in the eyes of the law, how you steal matters more than what you take. A man who robs a candy bar at gunpoint is treated more harshly than a man who walks out with a cranach and never raises his voice. Breitwieser had never used force. So his crimes were ruled simple theft, and he was sentenced to 4 years, most of which he had effectively already served. But the French trial in 2005 is where the human wreckage became total. Anne Catherine took the stand, gave her name and address, and then one more detail he had not known, that she was the mother of a 19-month-old boy. He had been arrested 3.5 years earlier. She had been pregnant by someone else within a year of it. He describes the moment as a bullet to the heart. And on the stand, she denied everything, said he had tormented her, that she'd felt like his hostage. He interrupted the prosecutor to defend her, insisting the fault was all his, that she had never been his accomplice, that she was telling the truth. His mother served less than 4 months. Anne Catherine, whose lawyer argued she had been a dominated, frightened woman under the grip of a controlling man, served exactly 1 night and had her conviction expunged and went back to her life. She seems, by every account, to want only to forget. Breitwieser served his time and got out in 2005, and for a moment it looked like he might build something. There was a ghost-written book called Confessions of an Art Thief, with a dashing photo of him on the cover, and a plan to reinvent himself as an art security consultant, the way a hacker becomes a cybersecurity expert. He would teach museums to anchor their paintings and upgrade their cases. He had a new girlfriend, Stephanie, who looked like Anne Catherine and had the same job, and whose name rhymed with his, which he took as a kind of destiny. In his stripped-bare apartment, he hung a full-size framed reproduction of Sybil of Cleves, the cranach from the castle, the real one long since burned. It was one of his 2 favorite things that no longer existed. He said it haunted him a little. And then, at the airport on the way to a meeting about his book tour, he walked into a boutique, noticed in 2 seconds that it had no cameras and few guards, and stole a t-shirt and a pair of pants for Stephanie. Then he walked back in and took $1,000 more. The guards were plainclothed, which he had failed to account for, and they arrested him, and the book launch became a punchline. A French journalist published his own book on the case, a merciless one, arguing that nearly everything Breitwieser said was a performance, that even the famous sensitivity to art might be an act, that all he had ever really wanted was to prove to his mother that he was someone important. And here is the collapse Breitwieser never saw coming, the one that finishes off the last thing he believed about himself. This is the man who found stealing for money disgraceful, who built his entire identity on the difference between himself and the common thief. But by the late 2010s, he was stealing Roman coins and paperweights and gold earrings from small museums, pieces he didn't even love, and he said so plainly. I've stolen them because it's easy, and I need money. He fenced them on eBay under fake names, and he moved cash out of his accounts before it could be garnished, using laundering techniques he'd learned from other inmates in prison. In the end, Breitwieser had become like every other art thief. The aesthete became exactly the figure he had spent his life defining himself against. The love, whatever it truly was when he had been 23, had rotted into the thing he swore it was not. Then later on, a brochure came into his hands, and in it was a small photograph of the ivory Adam and Eve, back on display at the Rubenshaus Museum in Antwerp where he had originally stolen it. It was the carving he kept above his bed, the one he used to reach up and touch. He didn't want to look at the brochure, but he looked at it anyway. And then he drove 5 hours to Antwerp in a disguise and paid cash for a ticket. And for the first time in 21 years, he walked into the Rubens house. Everything seemed almost the same, he said, as if time had folded in on itself. The display case was sturdier now, and there were more cameras and more guards. He put his hands on his knees and leaned in until his nose nearly touched the box, and he studied the ivory. It looked no worse for its time in the water. He felt, he said, as if he were watching someone he had loved come back from the dead. And then he couldn't stand to be near it, and he went out into the courtyard where the air was warm and the wisteria on the walls was starting to bud, and where it was quiet. The last time he had stood on those cobblestones, the ivory had been under his jacket. This time, he stood there and cried. He was not crying, he realized, for the stealing years. He was crying for the years since. He understood only now that the last time he'd walked out of this courtyard, driving home with Anne Catherine, windows down, the ivory in the trunk, young and triumphant, might have been the highest point his life would ever reach. He used to lie on that 4-poster bed and imagine dying surrounded by his whole collection, drawing his last breath in a room packed with beauty. And the works, which he always thought of as his, would outlive him and go on. But he had pushed it all too far. He walked toward the exit, through the gift shop, where they were selling a little booklet of the collection's highlights, with a full-page photograph of Adam and Eve inside. Maybe, he thought, he could frame this one too. He had no cash and no job. He had only made it to Antwerp on gas money from his mother. But out of an old habit he could not put down, he noted the position of the cashier and the guard and the other customers. He checked the room for cameras. There weren't any. And then he picked up the $4 booklet and he walked out the door. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.